Today, I'm going to talk to you about the social emotional intelligence and the needs of GT kids. And this presentation is both for teachers who might work with parents or have children of their own, and it's especially designed for parents. I've been doing GT for a long, long time. I may be the dinosaur of the group, pretty much 31 years. And during the majority of that time, I worked with both secondary and elementary kids. And many of those secondary kids I was fortunate to work with for 10 years. I want to say there are a lot of different ways to parent. There is not one right way. Just as there are many different kinds of kids, there are many different kinds of ways to parent those children because they each have different needs. Today, I'm not going to talk about headwear, which is providing opportunities that stimulate their critical thinking. I'm going to talk about heartwear, the part that actually is going to be a big determinant of success. Sometimes we can call their emotional quotient or their ability to handle problems, to face life with head on and have confidence as EQ or emotional quotient. And most of the time at school, we spend most of our time working on the IQ or that part that we think of where they have to learn and all of that. But studies have shown that actually it's the EQ or the emotional intelligence that is really going to determine success. Over the years, I've seen a couple of kids who are extremely intelligent, had high IQs, but really lacked those social skills. And for them, a life became a struggle after they got outside of academia. So let's look back at what has happened in GT programs that have to do with emotional intelligence. First of all, a lot of our secondary programs are no more. There came a time whenever we believed we were servicing secondary kids by them taking advanced placement. Advanced placement is an academic program. It is not a GT program. A true GT program is going to address the affective needs of kids, and that is the emotional intelligence. It's going to address the critical thinking for sure and creativity. And so it's been proven that the kids have the most difficulty with that coping skills and the ability to make good choices during those secondary years. And yes, we stop those and we put the emphasis on elementary, which is important, but then we gradually just slope off until finally those older kids are buried in the sand and there's really nothing for them other than AP. So I'm going to give you some random ramblings about things that I have learned over all those 31 years of working with GT kids. First of all, they're extremely complex. And you know that. So it's just like you can have 3 children or 2 kids, and your kids will be like one end of the spectrum, one in the other as far as their personalities. GT kids are just like that also. Sometimes the kids that seem the happiest and the most carefree are actually the ones that have an inner turmoil going on. So just because you look at your GT student and they look happy and everything looks good, those looks can be deceiving because we always have to remember we never know what someone else is thinking. And I know there's times that you've worried about things and people never know you're worried about anything. So that's something that you need to think about. In junior high, it's a difficult time for kids. So if you have kids who are finishing middle school or just entering middle school, you have to know that they're at a time when they want to fit in with their friends and they still love to learn. But a lot of the so-called cool kids or the kids that are their friends that are not in GT, it puts a lot of pressure on them to fit in more. They want to learn, but it's very difficult. Now, in the GT class, they can be themselves and be, if you want to call it, the stereotype of the intellectual nerd, which, that word's crazy. But it's difficult when you get them in those middle school grades in junior high for them to fit in. One thing that is important to know that all brain research will tell you that during the teen years, that is when the emotional part of their brain is supercharged. Their emotions are just at the top. So that's the reason they cry so much, or the reason they argue, that reason they just lash out. That's the reason they feel like they don't have any friends. It's because that emotional part is supercharged and it hasn't gotten under control yet. It's a lot more charged up than it is when they're children. At the same time, the frontal cortex, which is what helps you to make good decisions and choices, it is just beginning to form. And most brain experts will tell you it does not complete that formation until the middle of the when they're in their 20s. So here you have a time when kids have been given all of these choices, new choices, opportunities. They're very emotional, and yet their mechanism for controlling that and making good choice is extremely limited. One thing I think it's important is a lot of times we spend all of our effort trying to make sure that our kids do not fail. They get the idea that failure is bad, and particularly for GT kids, they find out that they need to be what is called perfect. I know this is true. I've seen this many, many times. Perfectionism is often misunderstood. A lot of people believe that if you're perfect, that means that you're going to always strive to do everything and no mistakes, everything has got to be perfect and causes you to stress out and those around you. But the true perfectionist would never ever be okay with getting a C. A true perfectionist would either rather fail and take an F or an incomplete if they can't get that A, because the C says, I'm not capable of doing better. The F says, I didn't try. And that preserves that belief that they have not failed in the eyes of others. Something important to think about. You must also be very careful about overprotecting kids, particularly when they are young. So let's look at this. And most are going to agree that there are fewer problems when they're children than when they get to be teenagers. And perhaps the reason is because of the emotional development of the brain, and also the fact that the frontal lobe is not completely ready to make those choices yet. But here are some things I want you to think about. Kids need to learn to handle frustration when they are very young. And so if you continue to pave the way, or the term helicopter parent, and they never have any frustrations, and then suddenly they get older and you have an inability to control their environment. Now then they're at a point where they have no skills at controlling frustration, and it's a lot more traumatic for them. You want them to feel discomfort when they are small because the problems are smaller. And instead of trying to solve their problems, sit down with your child when something is bothering them or they're having some kind of a challenge, and don't intercede and say, let's try this, or you could do this. Ask them, how do you think you can solve this? That shows that you have confidence in their ability to come up with a solution. And it also gives them practice for later on when the problems get to be much greater. You can discuss with your child and talk with them about what they think. Well, I might could do this, and you might could help them talk about, well, how would that work? Well, what would happen here? And that helps them to develop those thinking skills that are necessary for when they're frustrated in later life. It's never too late to start. So if you have a child who's 10 years old and you've never done this before, start doing it now and show them that you believe that they can handle their problems by thinking through them. One time I had a group of GT kids who were fifth graders come in my room and said, the kids at recess said that GT stands for giant turd. And I looked at them. They expected me to be appalled. I pretty much knew what was going on. We are going on a field trip that next day, on a pretty great field trip. And I was pretty sure that some of those kids might have gone out there and they might have been bragging about, oh, we're going on a trip tomorrow, all of that. Even if it wasn't that particular thing, there are times when our GT kids can have a sense of arrogance or superiority over sometimes their classmates. So whenever they told me that, I said, well, did you act like a giant turd? And that began a discussion. So our GT kids at school, from their GT teachers and from their parents, need to be made aware and constantly be reminded that they did not deserve or earn their intellectual ability. It's an ability that is undeserved. It was one that was strictly a gift, not something that they earned. And they should treat it as such. And I think that's an important thing for kids to start thinking about early on. We have to be careful how we talk to our children when we're angry or when they have just stepped on our last, as they say, nerve, because how they hear you speak when you are angry or upset or you are under stress or pressure becomes their inner voice. And let's look what that looks like. With boys, it's better if they're upset about something, if you sit beside them and not face to face. They handle that better. So if you have a son or a student that's a boy and he's upset about something, as you speak with them, sit beside them and don't look them in the face. Just look straight ahead. You'll be surprised how much more open they will be. You got to think about, what are your kids or what are your students seeing whenever something just goes bananas? Do you say, oh my gosh, I can't believe you did this? Do you do that? Because how they see you respond to conflict or how they see you respond when things get into the pressure cooker, that is probably how they're going to respond also. It's okay to let them see when you're angry, but showing anger is not the same thing as exploding. You can still speak civilly, and the odds of them growing up doing the same are much, much greater. I'm going to talk to you about a true story that I had. This was actually from a girl who was in the 10th grade that told me, but she said she'd been doing it for a long time. We were talking, the report cards had come out, and the kids were talking about their grades, and this was a really smart girl. I'd had her for a long time, and she was bragging about her B's. I never really had asked her, why she didn't make A's, because she definitely was capable. And so kids were bragging about their A's, and they said something to her and said, "You've never made all A's, have you?" And she said, "Oh no." She said, "It gives me wiggle room." And the kids said, "What are you talking about?" And she said, "Well," she said, "I found out when I was a young little girl that in school, if I had all A's and I had one B, my mother would talk to me about that B, and she would say, 'You need to try harder.' And I had all those A's, but she would always pick out on the B. And then I know I would get a test back, and the test would be a 91, and my mother wouldn't say, 'Oh, you made an A.' She would say, 'That's pretty close to B. You need to study harder.'" So I learned that if I make all B's and I make an occasional A, my mother gets really excited about it. She says, "Oh, you made an A." And it took all of that away. So I think the lesson to this is, we need to think about that. We need to celebrate the A, celebrate the B, and not put kids in the driver's seat on developing that wiggle worm as a coping mechanism with us. I had another gifted student who was in junior high, and he told me, he said he hated his science teacher, and he said, "I just can't stand her." Well, it was about a couple of days after that, and the principal called and had me to come over and said, this boy's name, and said, "He will not do this teacher's work. Just, can you talk to him?" So he said, when we were talking about it, he said, "Well," he said, "she doesn't like me. She doesn't like me because I want to skip ahead and go ahead and fill out everything. And she thinks I'm not paying attention, but I know what she's talking about." And so finally I thought, "Oh, how am I going to reach him?" And sometimes with GT kids, you have to flip it around and hit them from a direction they don't expect. So I said, "Well, I bet that makes her happy that you're not doing her work." And he said, "What do you mean by that?" And I said, "Well, I mean, she got to turn you in, and she got to have the principal call me over, and they're probably going to call your parents. And I'm sure if she really doesn't like you say, then that makes her happy." And he didn't say anything. And I said, "So what do you think? If she really, really didn't like you, what do you think would get her goat?" And he said, "Well, I guess if I did my work and made straight A's, that would really burn her up if I was, acing all of her tests." And I said, "Yeah, it probably would. I don't know, but it might." All right, that took care of his problem, because sometimes the things that we use and talk to GT kids to help them to see what is going on doesn't work with them. You have to hit them sometimes from another door they don't expect. I've had GT kids tell me, mostly in middle school and high school, that adults don't mean what they say. And if you ask them about that, they'll all tell stories about teachers they have had, or rules that their parents have had that they don't really enforce, or they may make a rule or have a rule, and this is also teachers, not just parents. And the first time they break the rule, now I told you you have to do this, and you all heard this same thing. I told you, I told you. But if you think about the idea that kids think that adults don't mean what they say, that should send up an alarm, and we need to think about that. I would never ever have a rule that I didn't plan to enforce the first time. I might would give them a little leeway, maybe perhaps once, but don't have a rule unless you intend to enforce it because it makes you look bad. This is another story about a winter coat. There's a thing to be said for letting kids suffer natural consequences that are almost predictable. They know that whatever happens, it's going to be back on them. So I'm going to tell you about this one. I had a young man, and his mother was pretty sharp. He was a GT kid, and she was pretty sharp, and it was actually getting cold outside. And so she told him that he needed to wear his coat. And he was in the fifth grade. He argued with her about the coat. And she said, well, I tell you, it's cold out. I'm going to wear a coat when I take you. And I really don't like to think about you being cold. And he came right back at her, I'm not going to wear a coat. It's ridiculous. All right, now a lot of kids are used to not wearing coats when it's cold, but this particular day was really cold. We'd had a cold front go through. And so she said, okay. And she said, I hope that you'll stay as warm as you can. Well, it was cold. And the next day, when they got ready to go to school, she didn't say a word about the coat, but he came out and got in the car and had his coat on. And so if it's not a question of their health and their safety, being without the coat during a 15-minute recess was not going to harm this boy, but it was going to teach him a really good lesson. This is something that I've used with kids and I think would work really good for parents and educators alike. If someone has crossed the line and they've broken a rule that has to be dealt with, maybe they've done something that really kind of ups your emotional state, and you're probably going to make some kind of a consequence that may be not appropriate, or it may not actually work. One of the best things to do is to tell the student or your child, you think about it tonight and I'll think about it, and then we'll talk in the morning. And what that does, it gives you a chance to calm down and to really figure out, what would be the best thing to do in this situation. And then you can go to sleep. But if your child is having to think about it, it may not be such a good night to sleep. They probably would rather you'd gone ahead and got it over with. And a lot of times that's what we're after, getting them to think about their own behavior. So this is a good strategy for you to try in some circumstances. You want to always give your kids an out when they're teenagers and be the bad guy for them. I have a story about this one. It was a young man who was actually an 11th grader, and his mother told me this, and I admired her for it. He had some friends that had started doing drugs, just some of them. And he knew that, it was going to come. They were going to be after him next. The dad was not in the home. It was just being raised by this mom. And so she was an RN. And so what she did, she came in the next day and she had bought some tests to test for drugs with urine. So she got those out and she showed them to him. And she said, I'm going to keep these on top of the refrigerator. And every once in a while, I'm going to give you what we're going to call our piss test. And so if I find out that that's what you're doing, then you know what the consequences will probably be from there. That'll be the end of you seeing these boys at all, despite what you do. You may sneak around and see them, but here's what I want you to know. I'm doing this so when you get with that group, and there's a couple of those guys that try to get you to do drugs, I want you to tell them, my mama is mean, and she gives me a random piss test every once in a while. I cannot take the chance because I have no idea when it's going to be. That mother was pretty wise because she gave that teenage boy an out. So don't be afraid to be the bad guy, because sometimes it's really hard for our GT kids to handle that pressure that we have no idea that they get from their peers. Some of our GT kids lack some skills that they really, really need. The one on the left, you have kids that come in, and it's maybe your own kids. They're extremely shy. Now, I'm glad there's shy people in the world to make up for some of the people that talk all the time. But yet, you don't want shyness to be a crippling factor in their life. I had a girl, a young girl, who was in my class as a second grader, and she just would not speak. She hated it when I called on her. She's a smart girl, so her dad said, maybe we should just let her quit. She's afraid that you're going to call on her. She doesn't like to talk. So I thought about that. So I called on her one day and she kind of hung her head down. So I asked her to stay after class, and I told her, her name's Carly. And I said, Carly, I said, um, you are a smart girl. And every once in a while, I want the kids to hear what's inside your head because you've got great ideas. If I called on you just once in a while instead of calling you often, would you answer then? And she said, yes, she would. And she did. She got more and more confident doing that until finally her parents and the teachers in a couple of grades said, you went too far. She talks all the time. And I'm proud to say that Carly is now a teacher at the school that I work at. So we need to help our kids when they're shy to get over some of their things that are troubling them about speaking and sharing. Not that we're trying to make them like everyone else, but we don't want their shyness to be so that they cannot participate in life. Also, the kids that have lacked social skills. I've done ballroom dancing unit every once in a while with high school kids, which is really helpful. And the kids that typically kind of stand off to themselves and don't have those social skills, but are definitely gifted kids, they actually grow and find themselves enjoying participating with others. I also had another student named Nathan that was extremely impulsive, a brilliant boy, really, really smart. When he was in the seventh grade, they called me to come over. And what had happened, his social studies teacher had had her first child about 6 weeks before, and her baby was born with a cleft palate. She was real upset about it, as you would be, because this was her first baby. And the doctors assured her, that it could be repaired. So she came back to school. She walks in the classroom, and the first thing that Nathan does is says, how's your hair-lip kid doing? Well, you can imagine the trouble that he got in. I think he got a paddling from from the mother, from the principal. His dad came up there, paddled him again, and the dad insisted that the principal do something else with him. This was several years ago. They don't do much paddling anymore, but maybe they should. And so I asked Nathan, I said, Nathan, what was that about? Well, I just wasn't thinking, and she came in, and so I just thought I'd make a little comment and welcome her back. And, I honestly believe him because he was impulsive. He moved away about the end of his junior year and managed to become elected. This is true. Student council president towards the end of that school year in a bigger school. The kids were impressed by his personality. He's fun loving. He came back to school as a senior with a red mohawk. The student body president did the morning announcements, and he was, let's say, impeached because his morning announcements got a little bit too entertaining. And he also sent emails of new pictures to the teachers from the superintendent's email. And so a lot of those GT kids are impulsive. A lot of that impulsiveness we've got to remember does have to be dealt with, but goes back to the fact that frontal lobe is not working yet. This is something else that works sometimes with kids, particularly kids, for instance, in a GT situation, maybe they're not getting a work turned in for a particular teacher, or with your own child at home. Instead of jumping in there and automatically making this a big event, I've done this before. Can you handle this, or do I need to get involved? They're going to always say, I can handle it. And they mostly do. Now, there will be times when they won't. But typically, this works with GT kids. We always have to remember, and this goes back to the emotion we show when we're thrown off kilter. When your kids, your children, or your students are at their very worst, that's when you have to be at your very best. So you can never justify showing the emotion that you feel like showing to a student or to a child because they're responding in a all out fit. That's when you've got to be your calmest. It's hard to do, but sometimes just knowing that and thinking about it works. I know this is a little something, but I once had a student. This was not when I was teaching first grade, taught first grade for a couple of years. And this little boy kept, as they say, giving the finger. And so he was not in my class, but I was in a hallway with these teachers, and they said, "You got any ideas?" Well, why don't you try this? And so what they did, they had the little boy show what he was doing. He put hand on a piece of paper. The teacher traced around it, and she said, "Would you want your mama or your daddy to see this picture, and you have to tell them what you're doing at school?" "No, ma'am." Suddenly the man came out. She said, "I didn't think so. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm going to put this in an envelope and put it in my filing cabinet. And if you don't do that anymore, we'll just throw it out in a couple of weeks or at the end of the year. We'll throw it out. And if you do, I'm going to mail it to them. And you can explain to them why this picture of your hand is here. I'm going to let you explain that to them." Now, that seems young, but this little boy was wise because he had teenage brothers and sisters, and he knew better. He may not have known what it meant, but he knew he wasn't supposed to do it. So sometimes with those kids, instead of jumping in and trying to manage the problem, put the monkey on their back in such a way that they're going to remember it. A lot of times that you're going to have to also face the fact with your own children, with your GT kids, that sometimes you are not going to change them. Some of them are just the way they're going to be, and you can fight it and you can fight it. And in that instance, I'm always going to put my money on the student or the child because personality is there. Kids do need to learn to deal with it and control it. However, you're not going to change some of the things that we see in kids that drive us crazy. So you can see the cartoon on the left. I have a funny story about a GT student who drove his mother crazy because he couldn't keep up with his things, just could not. And she was the school librarian. Whenever he got to be in high school and he was senior and getting ready to graduate, the joke was amongst the other teachers, what was this boy going to do to find a pencil? Because he never could keep up with anything, including pencils. I doubt that when he got to college that there was anyone there to do that for him. He may have learned the lesson, but as well as I know him, I'm pretty sure that he was always borrowing pencils. So for all of those years, that mother drove herself crazy trying to get this kid organized. And sometimes you just can't do it, folks. So be patient and accept them like they are because they'll still make it. This is another thing that I've tried with some kids that may be a little bizarre and off the wall. There was a book that my little girl loved called Bread and Jam for Frances. She loved that. And Frances wants to eat bread and jam all day long. And so the mother wisely lets her do that until she becomes so sick of it, she never wants to eat bread and jam again. Whenever the principal is gone at our building and there's an issue, they usually come get me. And this one particular time, the kindergarten teacher was just frantic. She had a little boy who kept pointing to his penis. And she said, "I've tried everything. I can't get him to stop. He will not do it. And well, I don't know what to do with him." I said, "Well, send him down here." So he came down to the principal's office and I was there. And I said, "Well, our principal's not here today. So sometimes when she's not here, I kind of help out." "Well, why are you here?" And he said, "Pointing." And I said, "Pointing? What were you pointing at?" And he didn't say anything. I said, "Were you pointing at the sky?" "No." "Are you pointing at trees?" "No." "What are you pointing at?" So he kind of pointed down low. And I said, "Are you pointing at your feet?" "No." "You pointing at your knees?" "No." And I said, "Well, what are you pointing at?" So he pointed where the spot was. And I said, "Are you pointing at your penis?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, you just keep on pointing at it. I've got to go run off some papers in here." He looked at me like I was crazy, and I'm sure he thought I was. And so he started pointing, and he kept looking around to see when I was going to come back. And I made a big deal out of running off the papers. And then I came out and talked to the secretary, and he looked at me, and I said, "You can keep on pointing. I'll be in there in a minute." And so then I went back in there after about 2 or 3 minutes, and I said, "Are you through pointing, or do you need to point some more?" And he said, "No, I'm through." And he went back to class and never pointed again. Uh, that's a bizarre story. There's a lot of ways to think about that. We need to always understand that feelings are real, even though they can't always be trusted. So when you have a child that says, I'm you're crying and what's the matter? Well, it's not as bad as that. That doesn't respect the way they feel. And we need to be really compassionate about that. And even if the emotion is off base, the way they feel is real. So you also need to share your emotions sometimes and let kids know that you're not always together. Something's bothering me right now. I've had times when I felt the way you feel, so that they understand those are all normal feelings. This is a good lesson for kids, particularly our GT kids. I would show this to kids, the multiplication problems over there. And it's not going to take just a second, and that one GT kid's going to say, "Oh, you made a mistake." And that's what you want them to do. And so what you tell them is, I want you to know this is a lesson for you. I only messed up one time out of the 10 times I multiplied 9. I did that on purpose because you did not see the 9 multiplication problems I got correct. You went straight to the one that I got wrong. And you need to remember, with your ability and the way you learn, there's always going to be somebody going to point out if you mess up or you miss something, whether it's a spelling word or a math problem. Somebody's going to jump on that. And you need to expect it, because that's the way people are. It is nothing to do with you, but you've got to remember that almost probably 90% of the things you do will be correct. And if occasionally the 10% that you mess up on, that's not very much. Now, then I'll go on and tell them I play the organ for my church, and I've played it for probably, I don't know how many years. And most of the time, I don't make any mistakes. But there's one gentleman in our church that if I ever get on the wrong foot pedal or whatever, he always will come up after church and say, "I heard that." And I said, "I knew you would." Make sure to use biblio-wisdom with your children and in your classroom. Tell them stories of things where there's really good lessons that are going to help them cope. I love to use these two. They were written by Mark Twain. One is the story of the good little boy, and the other is the story of the bad little boy. Well, the good little boy, everything he does is helpful. He's kind. He does the right thing. He goes to Sunday school. He does all these wonderful things, but everything goes wrong for him. Everything bad happens to him. He gets blamed for everything. It looks like he's messed up. On the other hand, the bad little boy is bad. He steals apples. He kicks dogs. He pulls girls' hair. He does all kinds of things, but it just seems like everything always works out for him. And that is an important lesson for kids, because we tell our children, if you do the right thing, good things will happen to you. That is not always true. Children need to understand that you do the right thing, and most of the time that's going to help your life be so much better. But there are going to be times when you do the right thing and it's still not going to work out for you. I think we need to be very careful not to give our children false impressions. And then when something does go wrong for them after their best efforts, then they don't have a way to understand why that happened. There's another piece of wisdom, a story I love. It's called The Woodcutter's Wisdom, and it's about a man who had a horse, and the horse bucked, and he had only one son. The man was old, and it broke his son's leg, so he had no one to help him on the farm. And the story will go on and on through each phase. But what ends up happening, the people say, "Oh, your son's broken your leg. You have no one to help you now." That was really bad, that happening. And the old man would say, "Well, whether it was good or bad, only God knows. All I know is that my son has a broken leg." Well, then a war comes, and all the boys are sent off to war, and they know that they'll never return because this is going to be a bad war. And they say, "Old man, you were right. Your son has a broken leg. He cannot be sent to war. Your son will heal eventually, and he will be with you." And the old man says, "Whether this is a good thing or a bad thing," and it goes on and grows and grows and grows. And then at the end, it has to do with a white horse. But this is a great story for kids because it shows that just because something bad, or it seems or appears to be bad, happens to you, that may turn out to be a good thing. And the thing that you think of, "Wow, this is the greatest thing that ever happened to me," could have a side that maybe you didn't see, that you didn't like.